In this module, we are going to talk about many topics that is really important for any web developer. So the objectives of this module is going to be to understand what do we mean by asynchronous calls in Node.js, and how to work with forms in general, and to be more specific, how to work with file uploads with Node.js. Then we will go through how to work with database, since database is really a key component in any modern web application. Then we are going to go with to understand and how to build REST API, which is like gonna be the last big topic in our course for this semester. Then we are going to use or to understand how to consume these API into your system. But before we get started, I just wanted to make sure that you are familiar with the following concepts from the previous week. Last week, I preferred not to do any lecture to give you one really important skill as a web developer. The skills that I wanted to give you last week is how to try to learn a new technology by yourself. Because once you graduated from school, then all you need to do is just keep practice and keep to learn new technologies. So if you don't have these skills, how let's say how to learn a new technology, then you will be really behind with all the other developers. So I preferred last week to just give you a resources where you can just go over it and learn from these resources. But with all these resources that I provided to you, they went through many of the topics, which is I listed some of the key topics here, which is how to create express server and serving files and static files. If you are not familiar with any of the following topics, then you should go and look it up before you go in this module. So another key topic, which is how to handle forms data in Express, what is the process pipe chaining in Node.js, which is really important, especially when you are when you want to build, let's say, REST API or even consuming API. Another important thing, which is how to work with template system, because once the end user is gonna send a request to your website, you have to render something and return it back to this end user. So using template system is gonna be a way easier for you to return back the whole content to the user. And I believe the NetNinja courses went through AGS. If you are not familiar with AGS, you may go to NetNinja resources that I posted last week to get yourself familiar with how to work with AGS. So working with file system in general is a key component of any web application, because at the end of the day, you are working with file systems. So another key skill that you have to be familiar with, which is the file streaming. Since you are doing, let's say, servers, or you are doing backend development, then you have to be able to work with file streaming. This is really important, especially when you are working with really big files, or if you wanted to serve really big files, and instead of just sending all the files at once, which is going to take longer time, just trying to get chunk by chunk delivery, which is a file stream, is going to be more efficient on both sides for the client experience, and on the server side is going to reduce the overhead. So let's get started in our topics for this week, which is asynchronous JavaScript. JavaScript is known as a single thread programming language, which means all your operations will run in one thread. From this definition, we can just conclude one main problem here, which is, what if you have statements that takes too much time to be done. So when we are talking about single thread, that means we will wait to this specific statement to end before we move forward to the next statement. So in this paradigm, or in this way of development, this is like causing really a problem. It might not be a problem when you are doing a client end, but when you are doing a backend using JavaScript, it's going to be a real problem. One of the main problem for that, what if you are creating a web server as you create like with Express JS before from the previous week? What if you wanted to just like create or make it one server? So in this case, you cannot receive any request while you are serving another client, which means you're gonna have like high latency in your application. And instead of just like going with synchronous JavaScript or single thread JavaScript, an asynchronous method means you may run multiple tasks at the same time without blocking or waiting for another task to be performed. And this is like really desirable, let's say, objective for any backend service, because you are not just serving one or let's say helping one user at a time. You are serving like your files to multiple users at the same time. That means you have to have asynchronously request to your application. So to perform some of the asynchronous in JavaScript, we have like many topics that it might like achieve the same thing, or we can just say it's just like a workaround for to add let's say asynchronous, or to overcome one single thread in JavaScript. One of the really important thing, which is the promises. So the way that promises work is like, let's just like start with, if you wanted to go through this line of codes as a JavaScript interpreter or V8 engine. So the way it's gonna work, it's gonna perform this line first, then it's gonna perform this line. If we don't have promises, or if we don't have any asynchronous calls, then I will wait here until I finish this request here. Then I can just like move to the next statements. But when we are using promises means, like in the easiest definition, I will perform this action or this line, and I will move forward if you give me a promise that you will perform it in the right way and you will get back to me. So I'll say it again. As an engine, I will perform this action and I will move forward as long as you promise that you will get back to response to me once you are done. So in this case, it's really important that it's gonna like add more speed to your system. So for example, in here, I'm trying to fetch some information from the backend, for example, or from any different system. What if we have some network latency? If we just like wanted to wait, then the latency is gonna add like more problem to the user experience. So no one is gonna like use your system because your system is really late. And even though like if your system is not that let's say slow, or your system is really efficient, but at the end of the day, you are not just like count how efficient your system is, but even since you are building a network application, you considering the network latency as one key factor of any web application efficiency. So for this one, that means I will just send a request and I'll move forward, because you just promised here, and this is like what we call it a chaining. You just promised that once it's done, you'll get back to me. So the way it's working, you will send the request here, and you just like jump all the way to here to perform any additional code. So what's going to happen in this case, once you receive the call or receive the response or the results, then as you can see here, this is sending the request. Once you receive the response, then what you're going to do with the response, you are like free to do whatever you want. Most of the time, either to populate these results from the back end and just like populate it in the front end. But like the key concepts here is you will send a request and you will move to the next statement, which is going to be in this area. So the rest of this code, this is going to happen once the request is done, or once the request has been processed and retained some values. So most of the time when you are dealing with any let's say API or something like that, which is going to be really important for you, when you are dealing with such a thing, all the time you're going to receive a response. This response is either a success with some results, or just a success, or a failure. So when we receive a response, we are going to deal with the response here. So in this response area, any kind of response, as long as we don't have any error, you will perform this action. But what if we have like some error? Then we will do the catch. So then it's going to handle the response, whether the response with just like an indicator of succession, or even let's say retain some results. So this code will be performed in case the response retain an error value or an error when you perform this action. But the key concept here is you will send a request and you will move forward to the next statement as long as you promised that you're gonna do like some process once the response is ready to be processed. So another important thing, which is really important, and I believe like you've worked with before, but just like to be sure that you are really like grasp everything you need when you're working with the forms, because the way that modern web application is working, it's based on the interaction between the user and the system. So one way to do the interaction is by using the forms. So the way it's working, as we mentioned before, most of the time you're gonna do one thing, which is you're gonna add your let's say elements or input types, which is in this case I just like used some input types, and we just like create two buttons here to just send like the username and the email. One main really like thing that's really important, back in the days we just like used to use just like the traditional HTML to perform the actions. That's why most of the time we are doing the action and the method back in the day, where like as we learned before, the action is going to be where your code is going to be sent to, and the method what kind of HTTP method that we are going to use. But as you can see here, we haven't used that here. That's for because like most of the modern web application, they're gonna use the JavaScript to perform some initial actions before like these data will be sent over to the backend. So in this case, it's really important to just do this line here, which is on submit event prevent default. So the prevent default is when you click on submit, it's gonna like all the data will be sent through the HTML functionality. So when you are using this line here, that means do not use the default behavior, which is using HTML for sending this form data. And instead, I will just like use my own implementation to send this information from the client to the backend through the JavaScript. As you can see here, I just like added this one here, and I just add the name here because I'm going to use it. I'm going to show it to you now how to use it. Okay, but the thing is, once the user clicks on, let's say, save changes, this function will be triggered, where this function will just like take all this information here and do some initial process on it, then send it over to the backend. So this is like the save changes. As you can see, I can just like get the information of, let's say, the full name and the email by using DOM, which is document forms. As you can see, the forms, I'm just using the name that we defined here, and then the name of the attribute or the name of the elements that I want to get the value of. So here, the name, user full name, and the value. So what you like, if you go back to this form, if you have like these, like let's say these two input types, which is like one for full name and the other for the user email, whenever you type in some of your information there by using these two lines here, you just like grasp what's in there and you are ready to use it. So in most cases, what you're gonna do here is to do like some sanitizing for your code to make sure that like all the inputs coming from the client does not have any malicious code that can exploit your application. But as you can see, I just like got like the information from the front end here. Then I'm gonna just like do anything with it. So all this stuff here, it's not important for me right now to go over it, but it's really important to understand. Most of the time, when you're working with modern web application, you're gonna use this one to override the default. So the default is any form will be sent through the backend using HTML functionality. And when we talk about HTML functionality, we are talking about sending to the action, which is specified here in the form, and using the method, which is specified here too. Instead, we just like, as I said, use just like one function to perform some initial actions or perform some initial process before you do any actions or any operation on these data. So one really important like topic for most of web developer, and by the way, this is like really important because most of the time you're gonna ask, like especially when you are building some real big applications, you will be asked to let's say provide a functionality that an end user or a manager can just like do some file upload or upload some resources or upload some materials. And it's not that hard to work with file uploads, but it has like, you have to be careful when we are working with file uploads, because file uploads most of the time it's considered to be just like you are trying to open a door on your system. If you are not careful about how to handle these things, your whole website might be compromised because of just like one file upload. So for instance, what if you provide this functionality to your user, and like the objective for this file upload, let's say, is just like to upload a PDF file. But instead of PDF file, one of the users, he just like uploaded ex files, or let's say shell script file. So in this case, if you give like the end user the full power or the full permission to run the uploaded files, then he might be doing like some malicious actions on your server. That's why you have to be careful when you are working with file uploads. You have to be careful how should you work with these kind of file uploads. So just like to be sure to upload the files, you need to do some work on both sides, on the client and on the server, as follows. So we know that file uploads is part or one of the inputs that HTML forms provide to us. So when you are working with file uploads, you have to add this attribute or the ink type. If you go to W3 Schools and look up ink type for HTML forms, it's gonna provide all the details that you need for that. But one thing here, which is like, as you can see in this form, you will add one attribute here, which is ink type, and there are like three main, let's say, values that may be assigned to this attribute. But the main one, which is gonna be multi-part, it's something like XML form or form data. Then in the form, you will add an input type with the type of file. Once you added these things on the client side, then all you need to do is handle the uploaded file on the backend. How are you gonna work with the uploaded file? So when you are working with the file upload, you should pay more attention to the following, especially when you are working with file upload on the backend side. So most of these actions will should be performed on the backend side. If you want to perform these initial actions on the client side, then you can perform it, but you have to double do it again, or do it again on the back end side. So you cannot just like do or trust the process you're gonna do on the side of the client. So most of the time when you want to do like some verification or some of these operation on the client side, this is just like to make sure that you are not sending any request which is not fulfill the requirements of your file upload. So the things that you should care about when you're dealing with file upload, the first one is file size. You cannot just like allow unlimited file size unless you have unlimited storage, which is like in most cases you are not having like unlimited storage. So in this case, why it's really important? Because you might have like some malicious user who's trying to just like overload your storage. So he's gonna upload like a really big file, and in this case, your web server is gonna be really busy trying to receive all the uploaded files. And another thing, which is once this file is uploaded, then it's gonna like let's say exhaust the whole storage of your hard drive. So it's really important to set just like some limit to the file size that you are allowing to upload. Okay, so another important thing, which is like really important, which is always check both file extension and the MIME type. Back in the days, like most developer, they will check just like the extension of the uploaded file. When we talk about like, let's say, the extension, then just like he's gonna take the extension, let's say image.gbg. He just check like whether this file ends with gbg or not. So just checking the file extension is not enough. You have to check the MIME type, and most of the modern file uploads modules is gonna provide you some API where you can just like check whether this file, let's say some people will change like the extension of the file to just like bypass the verification. So let's say if you are allowed just like PDF files, and I wanted to upload SH file to your system. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna change the extension of my file to be, let's say, file.pdf, and which is like in reality it's file.sh. Once it's uploaded, I'm gonna go there and update or just rename the file to make it sh. Then I can just like perform my actions. So here, the rule of thumb here, always check both file extension and MIME type. You cannot just like use the file extension for verification whether this file is supported to be uploaded to your system or not. So another important thing, which is do not allow to run executable file from the uploaded path. If your system functionality is to provide just like uploading executable files, then you have to have like some hidden area where you can just like the end user cannot know where this file is located in your system. Okay, but it's really important not to allow any executable file, especially when the user will have access to these files. Another important thing, which is like make sure you have the right permission to the uploaded folder. This is really important when you are working with like file systems that has let's say a right permission. So if you don't have right permission in your system, you just cannot upload the files, because the way it's working, you're gonna upload the file to the server. When the server received let's say this uploaded file, then he should store it somewhere in the root directory. So in the root directory, if you're trying to save this file to a directory that doesn't have a right permission, or the server doesn't have right permission, then you will not be able to achieve the operation that you're trying to work with. So for the file upload, one of the requirements for let's say the milestones you are going to work with is to do file upload. You can just like go on Google and just like do file upload using Node.js, and you will find like many modules and many libraries that you can use to achieve this operation. But it's really important when you're trying to work with these modules to make sure that these things are working fine. Okay, so another big topic which is really important like for any modern web application, which is working with database. So working with database is really like the heart of most of the systems, or let's say any dynamic web pages is gonna provide at least one functionality related to the database. So as I said here, database is a core component in most modern web application. When we are talking about database, we are talking about two main types of databases. One is the relation database, or the ones that you most of you are familiar with, which is SQL, for instance, MySQL, SQL Server, SQLite, Postgres, all these kind of databases, which is like the way it's working. You are saving all your data in just tables, and when you want when you wanted to fetch some of this data, you perform some of structured query language or SQL statements to manipulate this data from your web application. And this is really important, or let's see, key type of most of the web application, especially when we have like really let's say predefined schema that we have to stick with. But like lately there's like a new paradigm of databases, which is not only SQL or NoSQL for short. This kind of databases, it's not about like schema, it's about documents, it's about attributes. So if you have like really big and changing websites which is doesn't have just like all the data you're dealing with, it's not just like in one predefined schema, then it's better option for you to go with such approach, which is NoSQL. One example of these databases, which is MongoDB. And the good news is most of these databases, despite like the type, which whether it's gonna be NoSQL or relational database, you will find drivers that you can work with through your projects. It's really important to understand like the way you are trying to deal with like any database. If you're trying to work with let's say NoSQL, or even if you want to try with relational database. So the process you are going to work with whenever you want to work with database is going to be as follows. First, before you perform any action, you have to connect to the database server. So most of the time you will have, let's say, let me try to annotate here. Let's say this is the backend, and this is HTTP server here, and this is a request coming to here, and you will have like a database server here, or even like in a different location we will have the database. So the server should be able to communicate or connect through these like between these two services. When we talk about two services, it's like whether it's gonna be on the same device or in different devices. But it's really important to understand that you have to do the connection before you do let's say any operation, because you might have like multiple instances of the same database server. So you have to define which instance you are going to work with in this web application. So once you are connected, you have to select which database, because you might have like one server with multiple databases. So you have to select which database you want to work with. So once you select your database, then you will do like or write your own query. So when we say query here, any kind of operations, whether it's insert a new entry or update entry on the database, or deleting an entry, or even like just like list all the entries on the table in the database. So once you write your command, just writing the command or writing SQL statement is not enough. You have to do the execution of this command. So most of the time, this is like really important, because most of the students, they're gonna work with, or just like by typing the SQL, they will think that this is like the execution. But the reality, no. You have to write the statement and perform or execute this action. Okay, so once it's done, you will have to close the connection. And most of the current like modules is gonna just like do auto closing like once you done with performing your action. So when we talk about like database operations, there are like there's a known term that's described the operation database. This term is called CRUD, which is like stands for create, read, update, delete. Most of the time, you will do these four actions. So, for example, if you wanted to insert or create a new entry in your website, you will do like insert command. If you wanted to fetch all the data or fetch a specific or individual entry from your database or from one of the tables, you will do reading from the database. If you wanted to update one record or multiple records in a table, then you will use update commands. Whenever you wanted to delete some of the data from your database, then you will use delete action or operation. So as we said, like we have like 3 or 4 main operations. Most of the time you will do one of these operations, even though it's like, let's say like for example, you might do update just like to update one record or to update multiple records. At the end of the day, it's just like an update for like a specific let's say row or rows in the database. So like we can categorize these operations to have like 2 main groups. The first group, which is create, update, and delete. These operations is going to perform the operation on the database, and it's going to retain just like an indicator whether the operation has been done or not. Or in another words, they're going to retain the number of affected rows. So these 3 actions will not return any value from the database. It's just like returning how many rows has been affected. Okay. The other group or the other category here, which is the read. So the read operation is usually you will perform the operation on the database. Then you would like the returned value should be just like rows from the table. Might be just like 1 row or multiple rows. But at the end of the day, usually the output or the results of the read is just like a list of rows. The output or let's say the results of these 3 operations is just like an indicator how many row or rows have been affected by this operation. So in this let's say in this course we are using SQLite. I didn't want to go like with any advanced database system because we are not in a database course. So I just like wanted to reduce the overhead of just like going and install a server, all these kind of stuff. So SQLite is just like a file system database schema. So the way it's working, and this is just like creating a server to hold all your databases. It's gonna just create one database file system on your project, and then you can perform like most of the actions that you are familiar with performing, like let's say with MySQL or any kind of other database systems. So just like for simplicity, we are using SQLite. It's not recommended to go with this solution if you have like really a huge transaction on database. This is just like a demonstration of how to use database. But at the end of the day, the same process is gonna be used and applied if you wanted to perform a similar action. Okay, so here you may use any other database type in Node.js as long as there's support for it. So if you choose to go with MongoDB or if you choose to go with MySQL, it's your call. But at the end of the day, it's gonna be almost the same operation. You're gonna do like almost the same things as you are usually doing with any kind of database. So to download the driver of SQLite using Node.js, we may use the command npm install SQLite. This is gonna create like or install the driver that is gonna facilitate you like your system to communicate with the database. So as we said, like the first task that you usually do is to connect to SQLite. So connecting to SQLite, when you are working with SQLite, you're gonna perform the first 2 steps, which is connect to the server and selecting the database that you are going to work with in just like one action. So the way it's working, the first you have to include the module, which is like related to the SQLite 3, and then you will create a new database. So the way it's working, this is the name of the database that we are trying to communicate with. For SQL handler here, as you can see, when we are defining the database or this function is gonna look up like in the path. And here, since there's no path, it's gonna be like in the current directory. It's gonna check first whether the system DB is available or not. If it's not available, it's gonna create it for you. So for the first time, since it's not gonna be there, the SQLite will create this database for you. But in the following times, whenever like once you already like establish this database and you have like some data in it, then all you need to do is just like define the name here, and it's gonna be just like try to look it up. If it's there, then it's gonna use it. If it's not there, it's gonna create it for you. So one of the main things which is really important here, which is the callback. So the callback, it's almost something like a promise. So once this action is done, you will perform the callback function. So the way it's working is, instead of just like blocking your whole system, just like here, you will just perform this action and move to the next operation. Once this connection is established, then you will do some actions here. So the way it's working, I'm just like passing here in the callback, passing the connection error. I'm using the arrow function functionality in ES6. So I'm passing, if there is a connection error, then just like show this error. If not, then just like show in the console, show the connected to the database, which is just like an indicator whether this connection has been done correctly or not. So the minimal requirements here is just like to go with database without any callback function. But in our case, most of the time you will really need to have a callback function to make sure there's no error, like when to establish the connection to the SQLite. So when we wanted to fetch data or just like do a read operation from database. So the way it's working, as you can see here, let's just like go back. You can see here, this is like the handler or the connection pointer. You perform all your action on this pointer or this handler. So when you wanted to fetch just like one record or multiple records from the database, you will use the function all. As you can see here, this is just the SQL commands that you want to use. So one important thing here, which is this question mark here. Question mark here means a placeholder. Placeholder means I don't need to just like stick my data here, and instead of just like I'm gonna pass it here, and we will see like once we go to the insert or update, you can see like we can have or pass multiple values here. So most of the time, since like the action or this ID here, so for example here, what I'm trying to do is just like to fetch the user profile specified by this ID. Since it's gonna be just like this ID is gonna be received from the end user, so what you should do is just like grab it from the request object, proms, and just like take the ID. So the way it's working, you're gonna take this value and be replaced by the placeholder here. So in this case, the callback here either to have like an error while to try to perform this action, and the results if there is no errors happen when you are trying to perform this action. So this is just like the two parameters that you usually use when you're trying to work with fetching data, whether there's an error when you're trying to perform the action or perform the query, and if there's no error, what are the results that I'm receiving from this action. And as you can see here, return the rendered page with error. If you are using AJS, you will do like a return page, which is gonna show like there's some error, or the user just trying to pull the profile is not found, any like any let's say indicator that shows to the end user that this user has not or is not found. If you have let's say a results coming, or let's say the function here or the SQL retains some values, then most of the time you're gonna pass these results to the AJS template to populate it on just like one file, then return this rendered page to the end user to see the results. So when we are doing like insert, update, delete, it's almost the same thing. As I said, we have all these operations in just like one category, which is like update operation, or we said it's like categorized in this way because it's not returning any value. It's just like returning whether the action or the number of affected rows by this action. So the way it's working, all you need to do is just like change the command here based on the database you have. So here I'm just like doing delete. If you want to insert, if you want to update, you can just change the command here or the SQL here. But all these three types of commands could be performed on the database using the run function. And as I said, if you have like multiple let's say parameters, you can just like pass it here as an array of all the parameters you have. And most of the time you can access these parameters using the request object. So for this function, which is run here, there's one callback, which is like the operation error. If there is an error, then you should return a render page with this error, or if there is no error, then you should return a render page with a success message. And I'm sure like if you worked with the code from the previous lectures, which was for working with backend or to-do list, I believe like the Net Ninja has worked on something like this before. So one key important thing when you are working with database is how to make sure that the data you're trying to insert to the database is not going to cause any problem to your system. So to overcome and to make sure that the data you are trying to insert into the database or try to inject your database with is to use prepared statement. You have to make sure it's safe to enter these data into your database. And the way that you're doing this verification is by using something we call it prepared statement. And by the way, prepared statement, it's just like a terminology that you almost like find it almost every web application development. If you're gonna, if let's say if you are working with PHP, then you can just like look up PHP prepared statement. It's gonna provide you like with a tons of ways how to perform a prepared statement. So the way it's working here, you will do a statement, and you will do just like call a prepare command, and this is like especially for SQLite. You will do prepare delete from users, and you will perform as you can see here, passing the parameters. It's gonna just like pass these parameters to the placeholder, and if you wanted to pass more than one parameter, then you may pass it as comma separated. So you will do like something like this. When you do this, you will do something parameter 1, parameter 2, parameter 3, parameter 4, something like this. Okay, then you will do finalize, where you are like make sure you just like merge these two lines and perform the action. But the key point here is when you are using prepare statements, it's gonna check the inputs that's coming from the client, whether it's safe to be inserted to the database or not. And this is really important for like to be adapted like in all your applications, because usually prepared statements is following like the standards to clean any input coming from the client side. So now, since we are really done with database, we have like a full understanding of the key concepts behind how to work with database. Now let's jump to another topic. Most of the things that you learned so far is how to make a communication between your web system and between the end user. So the objective or the target here is the end user. So whenever you are sending some data from your server to the front end, is to be read by the end user. And that's why most of the time you are returning a rendered page or some readable text to the user, so the user can just like read it right away. But this is not like everything about web application. In many cases, you will need to have like system-to-system communication. So the target here might not be just an end user, might be another system. And as you can see, most of the time, the way that like you can read and understand the text and the objects and the layout, or let's say the visual output of your system, is super easy for you because you are used to it. Your brain is like familiar to it. But when you're trying to provide the same content to another system, it's gonna be really painful. So instead of just like make like the other system try to figure out how to read and interpret this content, there is another paradigm where you can just like, or another path where you can just like go with to facilitate system to system communication. So the way we are creating system to system communication is by creating something we call it API, or application programmable interface. In this case, you are having like, let's say, just like one example. Let's say you have one system here written in JavaScript, and you have another one here, it's written in, let's say, Python. And you wanted to have like these two systems to communicate. In the traditional way, if you want to create, you have to create just like one intermediate layer where all these things gonna be translated. It's almost the same thing if you want to make like a guy who speaks English and another guy who speaks French. If they want to talk to each other, you have to have a translator or interpreter here to be able to convey the message between these two people. The same thing here. Sorry. The first option is just like to use intermediate layer here, where it's gonna do some interpretation. But the problem with this approach is really expensive. It's not that easy. And whenever you have like a new development here, you have to do a development here. And whenever you want to have a new features here, you have to do some new implementation on both sides to be able to grasp all these functionalities. So instead of this one, you can just like create an API with a standard language where any system can just like communicate with it. So whenever you have something, you will make it available to the other systems to be able to communicate with. So there are many types of API that you may adapt it based on the scenarios. So for example, to make two clients, let's say my cell phone and your cell phone, we are sitting like next to each other, and we wanted to do like some communication. In this case, we might use something we call it WebRTC, which is a client-to-client communication model. In this paradigm, usually you may use this kind of API or paradigm to build some chatting system, since there's no, let's say, server engaged in this operation. But in most cases, you would like to make your system information or data available to anyone who wants to use it, and to use like some of external data and populate it in your system. Therefore, this kind of communication, we call it client-server communication. And there are like many methods to build an API to client-server, or even server-to-server. If you have like a server, let's say in the company in Charlotte, and you have another one in Raleigh, for example, and you want these two servers to communicate to each other to synchronize data between two systems, then you may create like this kind of communication. But the key thing here, which is like, as I said, there are many methods. One of them, which is SOAP. SOAP is like mainly used on the top of XML, or it's using XML. There is like remote call procedure or remote procedure, which is RPC. You can use it. But for here, we are going to use something called REST API, which is like really important for you as a developer to be able to understand. And by the way, RPC is getting like more attention nowadays. So REST API and RPC, like it's really important to understand. Even like a new RPC standards, or there's a new paradigm like from Google, which is called gRPC, which is really important to grasp, and I think it's going to be really important in the coming days. So what is a REST API? REST API stands for Representational Stateless Transfer, and most of the time you will find like some people call it RESTful API. The good thing about REST API is you are sending a request using any web protocols. The most common web protocols used with REST API is HTTP or HTTPS. The key objective is to build on the top of web protocols. So you may use any web protocols to perform REST API or create a REST API. When you're creating like a REST API, there's something we call endpoints, where we can find a specific data that we are looking for. That's why we call it endpoint. So let's say if I wanted to get like a list of all the posts in your blog, I'm gonna hit just like one endpoint, which is gonna return everything that I need, or it's gonna satisfy or answer the question that I wanna to be answered. Okay, so we will like go in depth in a bit, but let's just like take some of the key concepts behind it. I already uploaded like some of the files related to REST API. There's like one dissertation document, which is like, let's say, the dissertation for one of PhD students who came up with REST API. It has like everything you need as like a reference. It's not required to go through everything in there. I already submitted another files which is like easier and lighter in terms of understanding everything you need for REST API. But when building REST API, you would usually build a resource, and you will like hear a resource keywords very often when you are working with REST API. So what is a resource? A resource is just like another key word for just an object. So, or let's say a module. Let's say you have like a new web application. You have, let's talk about like the milestones that we are working on. In the projects that we have two main modules, right? The first module, which is the user management, and the other one, which is the post management. Okay, let's assume that you want to perform a single sign-on between two servers. In this case, you will need to build some endpoints that consume the user's object. Or what if like one of your friend wants to let's say fetch or get some of the posts from your website and populate in his website, just like a news feed, for example. Okay, here we call the user is a resource and the post is a resource. And to perform different operations on these resources, you will use different HTTP actions. So for example, let's say I'm gonna call the user here. This is the user. If I want to create a new user, I will go with like one action. Let's say it's post. If I wanted to go with update, I'm gonna do update. Like my drawing is really horrible here. Okay, if I want to do the delete, as you can see, I'm just like using the same resource with different HTTP methods as we learned in the first modules. Okay, and you will see it in a bit how it's already done. But the good thing about it is you have to have like just like one resource, and to perform different actions, you will use different HTTP methods to distinguish between the operations that you are trying to achieve. So let's examine the following operation on post module. Let's say this is like just a post module you have. To create a new post, you would usually use the post HTTP method. And this is like, let's say, we can say it's just like a standard. When you are using post PHP, post HTTP method on a resource, that means you want to create a new entry. When you want to like fetch some data or do a read operation, then you will use get HTTP method. When you want to update or replace something, then you would do update or put HTTP methods on a resource. When you want to delete, you will send a delete HTTP method to this post resource. As you can see, all these operations will be performed on the post resource. So the resource endpoints, we talked about like resource. What do we mean by resource? Most of the REST API would take the following schema. Let's say like the post, we will have like the post here. This is like the object name, and this is the object name, and this is like for the resources for the post module, and here for the users management module. So the general form of REST API endpoints would be as follows. Usually we'll go with protocol, either HTTP or HTTPS, or any other web protocols. But as I said, the most common protocols that use with REST API is HTTP and HTTPS. So the domain name, let's say uncc.edu. Then we will have a resource name, and when we talk about resource name, it might be like just like let's say something like this: API REST version 1 post. All these path is considered to be just like one resource. Okay, and if we wanted to pass some parameters, we will have it here as it's gonna be shown as part of the path, and we will see like live demonstration on how to perform such an action. But for now, let's just like make sure we understand like everything we need. And after that, we will have question mark. If we wanted to pass some query string, then we will add this question mark. So the resource name, so for example here, conventionally would be something like API. It stands for like API, or this is just like a special part of your system. In some cases, you might have like REST API, you might have SOAP API, you might have RPC API. So it's better to have like REST to just explain to the consumer what kind of API that he's working with. So when we go with version 1, let's say if you have like a version 1 REST API, a version 2 REST API, the end user, like, or let's say the other system or the consumer, I would like to call it here the consumer, he would like choose which version that you should work with, either to work with version 1 or to work with version 2. And here is the object name or the resource. Okay, so for the individual, I would like to call it like, most of the time I like to call it as identifier. So if you wanted to get like the end user by the user ID, then you will pass the user ID, which is like, by the way, it's the identifier of this user in the database. So for example, if I wanted to get like the profile of the first user or the user number 1, then I will pass number 1 here, and from my implementation, I will have like the ability to grasp this or get this parameter from the resource. If you wanted to add extra parameters, you have 2 options. One of the main options that you should have, you will add another forward, second parameter, forward slash, another parameter, another parameter. But in most cases, this is not recommended. It's not recommended to have it this way, because one of like the main important thing, that's why I call it like identifier. You cannot just like identify everything just like by using multiple attributes. One attribute should be enough to fetch everything you need. But what if you wanted to filter some of these data? That's why most of the time you would use the query string to filter some of the data. So for example, if you wanted to return a list of the posts that you sent or published on June month, or during the June month. Then you can just like pass the parameter as a query string here, month equal June, and you will have like some specific case that you are trying to, or you will do some let's say fetching these data based on these parameters. But as I said, it's recommended to have only one identifier to fetch this specific row from the database. And if you want to pass multiple parameters, which is gonna like work as a filters, then you may pass it as a query a string, as we will see later in this module. So to get all the users, this is like just a demonstration of how to achieve these things. You might be already familiar with just like doing some endpoints for from the previous week. Here you can just like keep the other endpoints or the other routes you have, and you may just like create a new one. So in your system, you may use, or in your Express implementation, you may use something for or like to retain some data to the end user, or just like a user friendly format, and to create another route that retains just like some data to be consumed by the end user. Okay, so consumed by another system in this case. So here I just like create get, which means this resource, if the action or the method that it's been used by HTTP is get, this is what you should do. And as you can see here, I'm just like passing to the users resource the action get. So in this case, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna fetch everything. I'm gonna fetch all the users. So the output of this function here should return all the users. But wait a minute. Here, when you start to work with AGS, you used to send a rendered page here in this area. And we said like the output or the returned value here should be something easy to be read by the system. And in most cases, the RESTful API, the response is going to be something we call it a JSON object or JavaScript object notation, which is something that we learned before. So here, the returned value, it should be just a JavaScript or JSON object. And that's why we create an object here. And if we have any error, then I will just like pass the error to this or assign it here. And since there is error, then there's no data. That's why I just like create an empty string here. This is like what's gonna be returned once it's let's say there's an error. But in case there's no error, that means I should receive some results coming from the database. Here I'm gonna assign it to the data. And here the way or the action of retaining this object. As you can see, the response object, I'm gonna return it as a JSON. So this results object is gonna be returned as a JSON. So to get an individual user, as you can see here, I'm passing some parameters. So the way that Express could be built, you can use a colon ID. That means this ID is going to be just a parameter. And to access this parameter, you may use the request object. As you can see here, the request object, parameters, then the name of the parameters here. So if you pass, let's say, user ID, you would have a user ID from here. Okay, and you will do the same thing here. You will do select from the users where user ID is the past ID here. Okay, and as you can see, request parameters ID is the parameter that is it's gonna be binding to the placeholder here. Okay, and as you can see, always the output of any API or this API is gonna be JSON in this case. So to perform a new action here, it's really important to understand that any read I'm gonna use just like get, whether it's gonna fetch everything or just like return one individual row. When you wanted to create a new user, usually you would use post action, and as you can see, I'm always using the same resource, so the user should be able to understand, like, when using different methods to the same resource, I will have different operation. So you cannot just like add users, add user, for example. Just like mention the name of the resource, and based on the actions or based on the method or the verb of HTTP, different operation will be performed. So in this case, as you can see here, I have 3 placeholders, and as you can see, I already have 3 passed parameters from here. Okay, and as I said before, add or create a new entry in the database, it's not gonna create any, or it's not gonna return any value. It's just like indicator. That's why I just like created this message here. Update user profile. As you can see, I'm using put action. Most of the time, you will have like an option either to use put or to use patch. As you can see here, patch or put. Most of the time, the key difference between update or put and patch, when you are using put, you will try, or what you have is you are replacing what you currently have in the database with what you already have right here. So when you are using put action, that means you will have the option to replace if the entry is already there in the database, or to be inserted if it's not already there. Okay, but when you are using patch, that means just update the entry in the database in case the entry is already there in the database. Okay, so like in the resources that I already like submitted on Canvas, you can see like the difference between these two things. And to delete the user, as you can see, always I'm gonna send or use the same. I'm gonna send it to the same resource, and like your server will distinguish between what kind, or differentiate between which action to take based on the defined action here. So here, just like delete, as you can see here, I merged like REST API with database implementation, as you can see here. This is like the key concept of REST API, and like with some implementation on how does it work. Another key important topic when you are working with REST API is CORS, or cross-origin resource sharing. When you are building a REST API, or when you are building an API, you cannot just like give everyone a permission to just like use your API. You might have some restrictions on how, like who should be able to use your API. Therefore, CORS or cross-origin resource sharing is a way that you, whether you allow or disallow someone from working or interacting with your API. So, as I said, like the main objective of building API is to make your system communicate with another system. Sometimes the other system is not under your authority, so you cannot just like trust it. As a security, you don't want to allow everyone to consume your API. You have to be able to allow or whitelist the people that you want them to communicate with your API. So CORS stands for cross-origin resource sharing, as I said, which make you determine which domains to use your API. So the way it's working with CORS, there's like another module. It's called CORS. You just like use it as let's say a middleware and Express, and that's it. It's gonna like handle everything. Then from there you can just like apply the policy. I already like submitted some documents about CORS that you should read and then understand and keep it as a reference for you in case you wanted to have like some advanced manipulation for your CORS. So now we learned how to build a REST API. Another key important thing, which is how to consume API. At a specific point, you might not be at the point of building an API. You might just like use an API. Let's say, for example, if you wanted to use geolocation service provided by Google, for example, it's really hard to just like go and build your own implementation to get like geolocation. Instead, you will just like create one, let's say, call to another API where you can just like consume this API and fetch the data that you need. So consuming API, when you hear the term consuming API, means you are fetching data or interacting with this API from different systems. Okay, so when we are talking like about interaction here, either to populate the results data or the return data in your system, or just like perform some specific action based on this API. When you are talking about like consuming API, there's like two methods. The first one is just like to let's say to test and to try whether like the API is working fine or not. But if you want to like this API consumption to be automated, then you should be able to use it through one of the libraries. There are like two common libraries that is like usually used when you are trying to consume API. The first one is to use like the fetch implementation, which is gonna use like Ajax implementation, or when we talked about Ajax implementation, then that means it's gonna be like the request is gonna be sent in the backseat. Once the results has been received, then it's gonna populate it on a like a specific section on your web page. So you are not just like sending the whole request and update the whole page based on the request. Another library which is really cool, which is Axios. Axios like the mostly common library used for consuming API. So the way it's working, as you can see, it's almost the same thing as what you've done with the Express server. As you can see here, you will just like include the file of Axios or the library of Axios. Then from Axios, you will perform what kind of action you are trying to perform, and you will pass the resource that you wanted to interact with. And most of the time, you will use promises here. That means your engine is gonna interpret this line and move from here to here, because Axios promised the engine here that he's gonna perform this action, and he will perform this, then, and catch in case the response come from the server. Okay, so the way it's working here, I'm gonna just like do delete if I want to delete, put if I wanted to put, patch, the same, almost the same thing that we used with build REST API. You may use it with Axios the same way as you can see here. So usually the consumption of any API either to have a response or there's a connection error. So in case of connection error, you will usually catch it with catch statement. And when you want to get a response, either this response is like failure or even like success, as long as it's not a connection error, then you should be able to communicate here. And one like of the main things that I think you worked on milestone 2 or 3, there was like some as I remember, there's some notification area where you wanted to update it. And as you can see here, once you receive the response, you should see something like this. You could do the response, show it like in a place where a response data, because all the response or the coming data, it's gonna be like located in the data here. Okay, so this is like the whole thing behind. Let me just like try to demonstrate one thing here, or demonstrate some of the cool tool that you usually would see when you are trying to test your API. So once you create your API and you want to test it, you may use this tool here, which is Postman. In Postman, you will perform here. Let's delete everything here. And now the resource here, so this is the domain, and this is the resource. And from here, we can just like choose which action or HTTP action that we are going to use. As you can see, all these actions are HTTP actions. So for here, I'm just gonna go with Lewis. Lewis, which like it's a language understanding interface provided by Windows Azure. I already created like this, let's say, endpoint, just like for our demonstration. I'm gonna pass here just like one parameter, which is the query. Let's say book a flight to Charlotte. As you can see here, the response is just like a JavaScript object. So in here, instead of just like creating my own application to try to understand the language, I'm just like using a different language or a different service where I can just like pass some input data to that API, where that API is gonna just take it, process it, and return the results. I don't care about like how does it work over there. All I care about is I'm gonna send you some piece of data, and you're gonna return me back another piece of results based on the data that I sent it to you. Okay, so here, just like one question here, or like just like a comment here. Some of you might ask like, why didn't I do something like this? And the reason for that, I told you before, here, if I wanted to pass something, it should be identifier. In this case, book applied to a Charlotte is not identifier. It's just like a query. That's why I just like passed it as a query, not just as a parameter. Okay, as you can see here, you can just like send all the data. You can see everything you need. If you can see, this is like the way it's, or let's say the raw data. And if you can see here, the header, access, control, allow origin, which is like part of course here. And as you can see, all these information that you really need to see. If there is cookie, you will see it here. And as you can see here, these are the parameters you wanted to pass. Here, if you want to do like some authorization, here is like some of the headers that you have. Here's the body. Okay, so you can have like everything you wanted to do. This is like really useful tools when you are trying to build or interact with API. It's really important to understand how to use it. But as I said, like the key or the foundation here is choose what kind of actions that you want to try. Here, the link of the resource. If you want to pass some parameters, you may pass it here. And all the time here, it's going to be part of the query string. If you want to pass it as an ID, okay, you may do something like this: form data or form URL in code or raw or binary. Here you might do like something like this: user ID is 10. This is gonna be sent as a part of the data or part of the quest you're gonna have. Okay, so this is like the end of this module. Hope you like it, you learned something new, and I will see you in the next module. Thank you.